Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Ben, and this is the monthly wrap-up for August of 2023. So in this video, I am just going to very briefly summarize the books that I finished reading specifically, in August of 2023. All of these books, for the most part, I have talked about in greater depth in previous videos that can be found on my channel. So if you really are curious about hearing more about any of these books, I would recommend going to those videos. This is just going to be a summary. So I'm going to try and get through it fairly fast. Now, one of the things that I was reading a lot of and that I finished, but I'm going to make a separate video about these, is the Lingua Latina books. So last year in October, I decided to start teaching myself to read some Latin. And it was going really well for a while, but then I kind of hit a brick wall with my studying. And that was, I think, it was some point in the spring. I don't remember exactly what month it was. It just became very hard. This is a book that, well, this is the companion book that helps you with this book. But this original book, a lot of people are familiar with. But essentially, Hans Orberg, who wrote it, he wrote the entire thing in Latin. The only English in the entire book is on like the copyright page. That's about it. Everything else is in Latin. And it starts off with very simple Latin, and then it progressively gets harder. And as you go, you start picking up more and more of the Latin. And that was true for me for more than half the book, but it definitely got very difficult around chapter 20-something. The last like 10 chapters. The vocab was increasing at a rate where I was having a hard time keeping up, and the grammatical rules were just getting crazy. I mean, Latin is notoriously difficult when it comes to grammar. So I found myself getting very frustrated, and I didn't feel like I was progressing, and it just stopped being fun. So I took some time off, but then I went back to it in August, and I determined to finish it before summer ended. And by summer, I mean summer vacation, because I'm a teacher. And I did get through it, and I did have a little bit of help from the Link app. I was using that as well as I was going through all of this. But I did finally manage to finish it, and I'll make a separate video about these things once I read a couple more Latin novellas, and I'll kind of do a general wrap-up video about some of my Latin learning. But this took up a lot of time in August. There were quite a few hours and days that I was just sitting here finishing this. So this was a good chunk of my August reading. But again, I'll talk about that in a separate video at some point in the future. Now, going on, one of the things that was going on in August was Book Trek 2023. Book Trek is an annual event where we read Star Trek fiction. I got some great co-hosts to go along with me on this, but I read 2 Star Trek fiction books in August. The first one is a very quick graphic novel. We've got Star Trek Countdown to Darkness. This is a prequel to the movie Star Trek Into Darkness. I found this for like 50 cents or something at a library book sale. So I figured, what the heck, it's Book Trek, I might as well read it. And I gotta say, it was okay. It actually wasn't that bad. I have a Book Trek video on this to go into more detail, but I'll say that overall, it did a pretty good job of setting up some things for Into Darkness, which is a flawed movie, but I still think it's fairly fun. And the art here is pretty well done. It felt Trek. This felt very Trek. It was very like a moral dilemma driven, philosophical type of story, so which I appreciated. So I'm glad I read it. It wasn't bad at all. The other thing I read for a Book Trek in August was Legacy by Jeanne Friedman. This is a book, I read it because of Christopher Pike being in it. Watching the new show Strange New World made me want to read something with Christopher Pike in it. And he's sort of in it. I mean, he doesn't really have to be there, the way that it's written. But essentially, we have 2 different storylines going on. Captain Kirk gets trapped underground when an alien monster whose planet they are on basically causes a cave-in. But instead of saving him, the Enterprise is promptly ordered to leave that planet to go save a bunch of colonists that are being attacked by an alien force. An alien force that Spock has come across before when he was part of Pike's Enterprise. So one part of the book, you've got Kirk trying to kind of dig his way out with some ensigns, and the other half, you got how how Spock is going to overcome his old nemesis. And it overall works. I had a fun time with it. I thought that the characters were pretty well written. I said in my review that some aspects of the plot were a little bit hard to swallow. It kind of leaves your head scratching exactly how or why they had to do certain things the way they did, but it kind of feels like it had to happen because of plot in a lot of ways. Nevertheless, I'm glad that I read it, and I would recommend it overall to fans of Star Trek TOS. Not the best Star Trek novel I've read by far, but it's definitely a decent time. Excuse me. Okay. I also read, and I read this one as a kind of buddy group read for Historathon 2023. Historathon 2023 is another event that I created where we read, we discuss, we celebrate historical nonfiction. So nonfiction history. And I read this with John David, one of my co-hosts for the event, and also a frequent commenter, Stephanie. And this is what this purports to be by Thomas Ricks. You got First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country, which sounds like a great idea for a book. I kind of wish that this was it. We don't really do that. In my opinion, Ricks strays too far from this premise too often, especially when we deal with George Washington. It feels like we leave this for long periods of time. We don't have to. Those parts with Washington feel like we're kind of taking biographical material and shoving it into the book really for no real reason, because it's not helping the purported thesis. And that stuff could be summarized in a few paragraphs rather than having many, many pages, basically chapters devoted to it. And there's a few other things going on here. His distaste for people like Jefferson, I think, kind of sours the book sometimes. You don't have to like Jefferson for me to like your book, but it seems like there's unnecessary criticism thrown in at unnecessary times when it comes down to it. You don't have to remind me repeatedly that Jefferson was somebody who wooed married women. Once is enough. You don't have to keep saying it. So that's another issue of mine. And like I said, we stray quite often from the central premise, or at least what it's supposed to be. And I felt like this book should have more been about the death of classicism in America and the rise of the Enlightenment. I think that would have been much better. Instead, he finishes the book off with things that we should change, the things that we should learn from the classics, apparently, that we should put into our American lives to improve the country. And I couldn't really see how a lot of those things connected. It felt like a big non sequitur. So I definitely was engaged a lot while reading this book. I didn't hate read it, but ultimately I can't really recommend it, and I'm not entirely sure I can trust a lot of the conclusions that he comes to, even if I am sympathetic politically to some of his views. Okay, last two. Last two I read for Book Trek 2023, although they were away missions for Book Trek. So in addition to reading Star Trek fiction, you have the optional away mission of reading books. Either one of them is a nonfiction science book, or you can read books that basically have to do with Trek. Here is Night of the Living Trekkies. So this is a horror book that deals with a zombie infection outbreak in Houston at a Star Trek convention. And this was fun, but not great. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how else I can put it. I did see read by Fred. Fred is one of my co-hosts for Book Trek, and I think he called it lame but fun lame. It's like it's lame but it's fun, and I guess I can kind of see where he's going with that. Some of the Star Trek references, of which there are many, it is like thrown in there with Star Trek references. Some of them were pretty good, and I enjoyed. Some of them were kind of, made me cringe a little bit here. It's a story that's not going to surprise you in how things turn out. My main thing was I kind of wish that it felt more Star Trek in spirit. Obviously, these guys are fans of Trek, and they throw a lot of trivia, inside there. Like, oh, here's an obscure character from this episode. But I kind of wish that it felt more like we were using what we learned in Trek to overcome this problem, rather than have people in Star Trek uniforms just cutting off zombie heads a lot, which it's its own kind of fun. I'm not gonna say it isn't, but I think it could have maybe elevated the story somehow. But so I would recommend this just to Star Trek fans who are interested in this premise. But no, I don't think anybody else would really get much out of it. And then the last thing I read is this. Fan fiction by Brent Spiner. Brent Spiner is one of the actors in Star Trek The Next Generation. He played Data. And this is his fictional memoir. This takes place in a sort of alternate version of the time period, which was the mid-run for Star Trek The Next Generation, where I'm not sure exactly what inspired this. I think Brent Spiner might have received some weird mail at some point, but in this version of things, he's receiving threats from somebody claiming to be Lal, which is a character that his character, Commander Data, in one of the episodes called The Offspring, he creates his own daughter called Lal. So this person, this psycho fan, is writing letters to Brent Spiner saying, I am Lal, and basically threatening to kill him and sending like body parts from animals to him. And he's kind of freaking out, and he's trying to get the help of his cast members to work through this. So we have the cast in there. And by the way, I listened, in addition to reading it, I like to go back and forth with these things. I listened to the full production audiobook of it, which was really worth it. And you get the voices of next gen actors, which is fun because the actors are not exactly playing themselves. They're playing these fictionalized, more humorous versions of themselves that Brent Spiner has written. And they're pretty funny, especially Patrick Stewart. He was cracking me up. And this is not a book to be taken seriously. This is a humorous book, and I think people have to go in there understanding this. This is humor. It's humorous, I'm sorry. It's a mystery. It's got, basically a love of Trek in here as well. And I would really recommend it, even to non-Trek fans. But you'd have to know something about Star Trek in order to really appreciate what he's talking about. But you don't have to be a Trek fan, I think, to find enjoyment in this. And I really liked it. This is probably, as I'm looking through my pile, I'm not counting the Latin stuff at all, but I'd say this is my favorite thing that I read in August. But in addition to this, I read, let's see if I can make my pyramid here. Fan fiction, I read Night of the Living Trekkies. I read First Principles, Legacy. Read a graphic novel, Star Trek, Countdown to Darkness, and just pick these up to the side. I finally finished my 2 behemoth Latin books. They might not look that thick, but when you don't know the language and you're trying to learn it, that's an awful lot of pages. But I did finish these finally in August. So if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.